Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson, Ukraine talks are taking place in London, but the US Secretary of State isn't attending. So, are we really inching closer to peace?
You asked and we listened.
The first 100 days of Trump 2.0 is almost over, but we're not done yet.
So we're keeping the podcast going every weekday at 6 a.m.
Join us to stay up to date with the latest twists and turns.
for interviews and analysis.
And stories from across the United States.
You can listen to Sky News Trump 100 now, wherever you get your podcasts.
This was meant to be a big day for Foreign Secretary David Lammy. His American counterpart, Marco Rubio, was due in town for peace talks, along with representatives from France, Germany and Ukraine. But on Tuesday afternoon, the US Secretary of State pulled out. The discussion will now take place amongst officials, although David Lammy is expected to pop his head round the door. All the while, the war continues, and the Americans say they will pull back from negotiations if progress isn't made. Professor Michael Clarke, our defence analyst, is here. How significant is it that Marco Rubio didn't come to London?
Oh, it's pretty important. I mean, this was going to be only the second meeting in which the Americans drew the Europeans into the whole design that they've been edging towards. And it's not now going to happen at that official level. So it's the fact is that if they can't meaningfully talk to each other as foreign ministers, then the discussion has to take place at a lower level, which is between other representatives and military chiefs, really.
Does that mean necessarily that progress will not be made today?
No, some progress may be made, so it may well be that they can firm up some of the things that they talked about over a week ago in terms of what the Europeans might provide in military terms as a safeguarding force or reassurance force, whatever that might be. We're still a long way away from any specific things on that. And also to exchange views, to get a better idea. What is the United States really proposing? How would the Europeans likely react to that? Would they go along with it? Would they have caveats? So there's quite a lot you can do at these levels in order to feed upwards to the principal decision makers, what sort of ground they're standing on. But it's no substitute for having the principal decision makers look each other in the eye and say, this is where we think we are.
I suppose we really should dwell on the fact that the war continues. I mean, the kinetic activity on the ground in Ukraine, I mean, we are still seeing plenty of violence.
Yes, the situation is still extremely violent. The front lines haven't moved very much because the Russians have slowed right down. They're not taking anything at the moment. And they're still losing, according to the British Ministry of Defence, an average of 1,300 men a day.
Incredible.
Every day.
Incredible numbers.
That's deaths and seriously wounded. So every day, 1,300 men come off the front line or fail to go home. And the official British figure from British intelligence is that the Russians have now lost 940,000 people. So they'll be on the million figure pretty soon. So yes, not much is changing on the front lines, but the fighting is intense. Every night, the Ukrainians are bombarded with more drones and missiles. They're only shooting down about 50% of them now. A year ago, they were shooting down 85 and 90% of them, but because their air defense is getting exhausted, they're running out of ammunition, they're only getting about 50%, so more civilians are being killed, and so it goes on.
I mean, we are now in a position of saying that Easter truce proposed by Vladimir Putin, I mean, it just didn't happen, did it?
It was never meant to. No, I mean, to declare a truce out of the blue, suddenly say, I declare a truce for 24 hours, across a line of contact that's 1,000 kilometres, where 700,000 of your people are fighting, and 500,000 of the opposition, the Ukrainians, are fighting. The idea that you could have an instant truce by clicking your fingers was stupid in the first place.
Particularly given that everyone's got itchy trigger fingers.
Impossible. I mean, the reason that they declared it was to keep Trump on the hook. I mean, for Putin to, as it were, keep playing to Trump's agenda to say, I'm in favour of peace. Of course, it's not easy. It's not easy for us. It's a difficult process. You've got to appreciate this is going to take us some time. But as a gesture of goodwill, I'm declaring a truce. Well, it was a meaningless truce to declare instantly for 24 hours, and it didn't happen. But it's enough to feed Trump's willingness, his desire to believe pretty well everything that Putin tells him.
So what do we understand the US peace plan to be? I mean, we haven't got all the details, but we are getting shades of the outline of it, I suppose.
Yeah. It's something a bit closer to the plan that Keith Kellogg devised last November.
Now, remind us, Keith Kellogg.
Yeah, now Keith Kellogg is ex-military. He's 80-odd now, but he's got a respectable military career behind him as paratrooper, and wrote this paper, the last 2 pages of which, outlined this is what we should do next. And that was the outline of a plan. And people looked at it and said, well, okay, this is a plan for a ceasefire in place, The Ukrainians have got to give up, at least de facto, about 20% of the territory. And if the Russians won't go along with that, we've got to be prepared to put pressure on the Russians. Mm-hmm. And that paper was thought to be not good news, but plausible. But I mean, the Europeans thought, well, this is something we could work with. Then Keith Kellogg was sidelined from the whole process because he was not close enough to what the White House seemed to want. And now he's been brought back in because all the other avenues seem to have failed so far. The Americas has tried. So they brought Keith Kellogg back in. And it's Keith Kellogg who's in London today. Mm-hmm. And it looks as if it's part of his plan, which is now under discussion, but only part.
It seems to me to involve the Ukrainians giving up quite an awful lot of their sovereign territory. I mean, simply put.
About 20%. And what it revolves around is that they say, we'll have a ceasefire in place. So the Russians will hold what they've got, but they won't hold what they've claimed, because they claimed all 5 regions, only one of which, Crimea, they've held in total since 2014. The other 4, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaparasia and Kherson, they claimed them all back in September 2022. They annexed them officially, even though they didn't control them. And they still don't control all of them, though they control most of those other 4 territories. So ceasefire in place means that the Russians don't control all of the 4 new territories that they've just said are now Russian, and that they will withdraw a little bit from the Dnieper River in Kherson in order to make sure that Ukraine has access to the river.
Sure.
Because that river is really important to the economic health of Ukraine, as it would do, just look at a map. And that they would do that. In return, the Russians would get official recognition of their ownership of Crimea. America would recognize that officially. Now, that's a big deal in principle terms, in principle, because that's a fundamental contradiction of international law, which is recognizing legally a change of territory by force.
Why is Crimea so totemic for the Russians, but also I think practically it's a key territory for them?
It is. It's a key place geographically because it's there on the Black Sea. So it controls the Black Sea, both eastern and western. And so it's strategically very important. And it became part of the Soviet empire. I mean, to put it very crudely, Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine when Ukraine was one of the republics of the USSR.
Former Soviet premier. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And he gave it to Ukraine to be under Ukraine's administration. Ukraine inherited Crimea when it became an independent state in 1991. And so it is legally, Crimea is Ukraine. But it does have a history that's different to the rest of Ukraine. And I think most people would accept that whatever happens in this war, the Ukrainians can claim that they have to have Crimea back, but it won't happen for several generations, if ever.
I mean, how does this work? We've got a Ukrainian president who has said, we will not accept giving up any of our territory. I mean, he's got to talk a good game, but presumably he understands that if there is going to be an end to this conflict, the Russians aren't walking away empty-handed.
No, and I think in a way that would be the easier thing for him to grant, as it were. If that were the only concession that brought peace and a viable future for Ukraine, I'm sure he would make it. Because whatever happens to Crimea, it's now a difficult territory to bring back into Ukraine. Because, I mean, since the Russians took it in 2014, they brought in about 800,000 Russians. They've colonized the place. And the Ukrainians are bound to hold on to this as a matter of principle. Why should they give up any of their territory? Because if they're pushed to give up Crimea, then they'll be pushed to give up this and that and something else. So they'll hold on to it. But in an ideal world, there would be a negotiation in which they come out of it with a viable, independent, European-orientated state, and the price for it is that they give up Crimea, which actually, in practical terms, is not too difficult to give up.
Isn't the other side of the coin, though, that this is the first point that we are hearing reports of? We haven't got anything concrete yet, but we are hearing reports that the Russians are stepping back from, as you described it, that maximalist position of the 5 territories plus Crimea, every yard gained is ours, and more.
If they mean it, yeah. I mean, all we know at the moment is this is an American proposal. It's based apparently on what Witkoff got out of Putin a couple of weeks ago when he was in Petersburg with him.
Stephen Witkoff, of course, yeah, he is Donald Trump's special envoy as opposed to Kellogg, who is the Ukraine envoy.
Now, we don't know that for certain, but this is what Witkoff has taken back to the White House to say the Russians have indicated that they might accept a ceasefire in place. But as far as we know, they're only saying, well, they might accept. I mean, in Russian behavior, we know that they'll accept it after lots more conditions. And I suspect myself that what's going on here is that Putin is trying to maneuver Trump into forgetting about the peace plan altogether, moving on, which we think Trump wants to do, but blaming the Ukrainians and the Europeans for the failure. So Putin is trying to maneuver the situation whereby you say, look, I'm prepared to do this, and this. Of course, if you can meet my conditions, and my conditions are ones that Ukraine doesn't agree to, so it's the Ukrainians' fault that it's all failed.
Want to speak about very specifically about Donald Trump in just a second, but in terms of the peace plan, and again, we do not know the details. This is all reports and sources and all the rest of it. The Zaparasia power plant, nuclear power plant, something that we've talked about on the podcast a number of times before. There seems to be this suggestion that whilst it is currently in Russian control, rather than, as part of a peace deal, it being returned to the Ukrainians, some other country takes over running it, perhaps even the United States.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, because the Zaparasia power plant's the biggest power plant in Ukraine. It's one of the biggest, I think maybe even the biggest in Europe. And they're not being maintained properly by a skeleton of Ukrainian workers working under duress for the Russians and so on. So an independent Ukraine that might emerge from this theoretical process has to have access to the power that it can get from Zaparasia. So the Russians aren't going to provide that power if they occupy the plant, so somebody else has to. If the front lines are frozen where they are, then the power plant is on the wrong side of the lines from Ukraine's point of view.
Yeah.
So a bit like, Berlin in the Cold War, make it an international site.
Right.
And run it with, international engineers or something like that.
I mean, the Russians really do not want to have a nuclear disaster in Zaporizhia, do they?
They shouldn't.
But they've come close to it, I think, during the conflict, haven't they?
There have been all sorts of rumours that they've been not too far away from it. And they don't want another Chernobyl. So the principle might be that the Russians withdraw from the plant, let somebody else run it on Ukraine's behalf, even if the Russians won't allow the Ukrainians to run it directly.
Do you think we're going to get anywhere close to a peace deal without there being security guarantees for the Ukrainians? Because it does seem to me that NATO membership is off the table for them, for the time being at least.
We're not going to get anywhere near a peace deal at the moment. I mean, a peace deal is generations away.
Yeah.
That is a peace between what Russia wants and Ukraine's demand to be left alone. I mean, that's generations away. So we're talking 40 to 60 years.
Okay.
We might be within reach of a ceasefire, but at the moment, it would be a very unstable ceasefire. Unless it's enforced in some way by external players, which means maybe European troops with a guarantee from the United States, which the US says it won't now provide. Unless we can put in place those things, then the best we can hope for is an unstable ceasefire that might last for a couple of months or, if you're lucky, a year before. But it will break down. I mean, I'm fairly certain about that. The proposals at the moment are just all hanging in the air. They're not linked to anything that would lock them down on the ground in ways that people would respect.
We've mentioned this before, but it is fair to say right now, judging him on his actions and his words, Donald Trump is fast losing patience and indeed interest in solving things in Ukraine.
Yeah, he's moving on. Peace plan for Ukraine, which is going nowhere.
Which was, I thought it was going to be ready to go on day one, wasn't it? He could bring about peace within 24 hours. Yeah,
nobody else thought that,
of course.
And so that's running out of road, I think, rapidly. And we might be wrong. Neil, I'd be really happy to be wrong. I'd be happy to sit here in a month's time and say, Neil, I was totally and completely wrong. I'd love that to be the case, but I don't think it will be. And so he's going to move on. The next thing he'll move on to is Iran, trying to create a new situation with Iran, either through a deal or a pressurized new beginning with Iran. So that's his latest thing. He won't sit around and, as it would, be associated with failure. The idea is he moves on and he blames failure on somebody else. And Putin understands that. The Russians are very good at this sort of thing. And they know they're trying to maneuver him into a situation where he blames Zelensky and the Europeans for the failure.
But I've read a number of big thinkers on this topic suggesting that Donald Trump losing interest in solving Ukraine is perhaps the best thing to have happened to Ukraine, in a couple of years, that this gives them an opportunity to perhaps not capitulate to the extent which the US president seems hell-bent on demanding of them.
Yeah. If the Ukrainians can stay in the war, that may be the least worst option because they're not doing so badly. The Russians are not doing terribly well, and things will get much harder for Russia, all the analysts agree, by the end of the year, both militarily and in terms of their economy. I mean, this is what's so frustrating about it from Kiev's point of view. At the moment when sanctions would begin to have a much bigger effect on Moscow, at a moment when the war and the lack of real progress would have a much bigger effect, suddenly all the pressure's coming off Moscow when it might have started to make a difference. And so here we are at the very moment when the Ukrainians might have had something to really hope for. The ground's been pulled from under, carpet's been pulled from under their feet by the new American administration. So carrying on with the war, staying in the war, might be the least worst option. However, they can only stay in the war on the present basis if America keeps cooperating with intelligence sharing, and they may not. And in particular, if the Americans turn off Starlink, if Elon Musk turns off Starlink, 40,000 terminals around Ukraine, which are fundamental to its battlefield abilities, the Europeans can compensate a bit for that, but only a bit. So if they turn that off, then the Ukrainians will start to find it very difficult indeed to carry on the war the way they've done so far. Not impossible, but difficult.
The only thing that seems certain is that you and I will be discussing this again on the podcast.
I'm afraid so, yeah.
Indeed. Michael, thanks very much. Well, for the latest on those peace talks, just head to the website, skynews.com. The Daily is back tomorrow.
You asked and we listened.
The first 100 days of Trump 2.0 is almost over, but we're not done yet.
So we're keeping the podcast going every weekday at 6 a.m.
Join us to stay up to date with the latest twists and turns.
for interviews and analysis.
And stories from across the United States.
You can listen to Sky News Trump 100 now, wherever you get your podcasts.